The wind that came down from the Bighorn Peaks was cold enough to crack a man's lips. But down here in the valley, the air hung heavy and still, tasting of dust and dried horse manure. Jonah Cade pulled the brim of his hat lower against the midday sun. He had been riding for 3 days, leaving behind the high timber and the silence of the snow line for the noise and stench of civilization. He did not like it. He never had. But a man could not eat pine needles, and his horses could not survive the coming winter on mountain scrub alone. Jonah was a man built of rawhide and silence, 33 years of age, but looking older, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting at horizons that refused to stay put. He wore buckskins that had been smoked dark over hickory fires, greased to keep out the wet, and smelled faintly of sage and old blood. A Sharps rifle rested in the leather scabbard by his knee, a heavy piece of iron that had ended more conversations than it had started. He rode a roan gelding that was as sure-footed as a mountain goat, towing a pack mule that laid its ears back and snapped at the flies buzzing around its eyes. Red Hollow sat in the basin like a festering sore. It was a town of raw lumber and bad intentions, thrown together to service the cattle drives and the railroad that was creeping its way west like a steel snake. As Jonah rode down the main street, he could feel the eyes on him. The townfolk looked at him the way domestic dogs looked at a wolf, with a mixture of fear and a deep, ancestral hatred. He was a mountain man, a relic of a time that was fading fast, and they were the future, soft and loud and crowded. He reined in the roan in front of the livery stable, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not rush. Rushing got a man killed in the high country, and down here, it just made him look nervous. He dismounted, his boots hitting the dry earth with a heavy thud. He tied the animals and patted the roan's neck, whispering a few words in the Lakota tongue, a habit he had picked up from Chayton. Chayton was up there now, watching the passes, waiting for Jonah to return with the supplies that would see them through the snows. Jonah walked toward the general store, the spurs on his heels chiming a low, discordant rhythm. The sign above the door was faded, peeling paint declaring it to be Miller's General Goods. Inside, the air was cooler but thick with the smell of pickled eggs, kerosene, and cheap tobacco. The storekeep, a balding man with eyes like nervous beads, looked up from the counter. He hesitated before nodding. "Morning," the man said. "Afternoon," Jonah corrected him, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat. "I need grain, barley and oats, 500 pounds. The storekeep whistled through his teeth. "That is a heavy order. Stranger, grain is scarce this season. Mr. Varner has been buying up most of the feed for his stock." Jonah stiffened at the name but kept his face blank. "I have coin and furs." He dropped a heavy bundle of beaver and fox pelts onto the counter. The fur was thick, prime winter coats trapped high up where the cold made the animals grow it dense. The storekeep ran a hand over a silver fox pelt, his greed momentarily overcoming his caution. "Fine skins," the man muttered. "Fine skins indeed. I can give you the grain, but the price is up, 4 cents a pound." 3 cents, Jonah said. It was not a question. The man looked at Jonah, really looked at him, taking in the knife at his belt and the cold, flat look in his gray eyes. 3.5 cents, the storekeep countered weakly. "And I will throw in a sack of salt." Jonah nodded once. "Done. I need coffee too. Beans, not grounds, and lead. 5 pounds of it." As the storekeep began to weigh out the goods, the bell above the door jingled. 2 men walked in, dusting off their coats. They wore the look of men who were paid to be mean, low-slung gun belts, dusty coats, and the swagger of those who knew the law was on their payroll. They ignored Jonah and leaned against the counter. "You hear about the widow?" one of them asked, not bothering to keep his voice down. He was a thick-necked man with a scar running through his eyebrow. The storekeep glanced nervously at Jonah before answering. "I hear things, always hear things. Sheriff Briggs says she has got till the end of the week," the thick-necked man said, laughing a sound that was more bark than mirth. "Varner is done playing nice. That bitch is sitting on the only water that runs deep enough to water 1,000 head. and she acts like she is the Queen of England." "She is bad luck," the second man said. He was younger, with a nervous twitch in his cheek. "Everyone knows she poisoned her husband." Old man Marsh was strong as an ox. Then one day, bam, dead in his bed, belly full of arsenic. "I bet." Jonah stood with his back to them, examining a tin of percussion caps. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He knew the type. They were coyotes barking because the lion was fed. It was none of his business. He had come for grain, not for justice. "Water belongs to the man who can hold it," the first man said. "And a woman alone, she cannot hold anything, especially not with that bad blood she carries. I heard she lets the Indians camp on her north ridge, lets them drink from the creek like they are people." Jonah felt a muscle in his jaw jump. The Lakota, Chayton's people. The water the man spoke of was the Sweetwater Fork. It ran through the valley and cut across the land the white men called Marsh Ranch. It was sacred to the tribe, a place of healing. If Varner took it, he would fence it, damn it, and choke the life out of everything downstream. "Here is your coffee," the storekeep said loudly, trying to cut the tension. "And the lead." Jonah turned, placing a small pouch of gold dust on the counter next to the furs. It was enough to cover the difference. "Load the grain on the mule outside," Jonah said. "I will take the rest now." He gathered his supplies, feeling the eyes of the two hired guns on his back. "You a friend of the widow, mountain man?" the thick-necked man asked. Jonah paused at the door. He did not turn around. "I'm a friend to my horse," he said. "And he's thirsty." He stepped out into the blinding sunlight, leaving the store's gloom behind, but the words stuck to him like burrs. Poisoned her husband. Bad luck. He had heard these kinds of stories before. Small towns needed monsters to make themselves feel righteous. It was easier to hate a woman alone than to admit they were all afraid of the man who held the town's leash. Caleb Varner. The name tasted sour in his mind. Jonah had seen Varner's brand on cattle stretching for 50 miles. A V inside a circle. It looked like a target. Jonah loaded the heavy sacks of grain onto the pack mule, securing the diamond hitch with practiced ease. He checked the cinch, checked the hooves. He was stalling. He knew he should mount up and ride out. The mountains were calling him back, promising clean air and silence. But his stomach growled. He had not eaten a hot meal in a week. He tied the animals to the rail outside the Red Dog Saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. The place was dim and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. It was early afternoon, so the crowd was thin, mostly card players and drifters. Jonah ordered a plate of stew and a mug of beer, taking a table in the corner with his back to the wall. He ate mechanically, his eyes scanning the room. It was an old habit, one that had kept him alive when he scouted for the army, and later, when he lived among the Lakota. Never stopped looking, never stopped listening. At the bar, 3 men were drinking whiskey. They were loud, boasting about a job they had done down near the border. One of them turned to call for another bottle, and the light from the window hit him full in the face. Jonah froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. The man was big, with a beard that hid most of his face. But it was not his face that stopped Jonah's heart. It was his arm. The man had rolled up his sleeves against the heat. On his left forearm, just below the elbow, was a burn scar. It was not a random burn. It was shaped distinctively a horseshoe, branded upside down. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the saloon faded into a dull roar, like blood rushing in ears. 6 years ago, the smoke was so thick it choked out the sun, the screams of the women, the laughter of the men who rode through the tents, firing into the hides. Jonah had been 3 miles away, hunting with Chayton. They had seen the smoke too late. They had run until their lungs burned. But when they arrived, there was only silence and the crackle of dying fires. The soldiers had denied it. They blamed renegades. But Jonah had found a track, a broken spur, and a description from a dying elder who whispered of men who laughed and branded the dead like cattle, a group of mercenaries who called themselves the Iron Hooves. They marked themselves with an inverted shoe. Jonah lowered his spoon. His hand was shaking. He clenched it into a fist until the knuckles turned white. That scar. It was the mark. The man at the bar laughed, slapping his friend on the back. "Easy money," the man said. "Varner pays well for fire starters." The name again. Varner. Jonah felt a cold rage unfurl in his gut. Sharp and deadly. He wanted to stand up, walk over to the bar, and drive his knife into the man's throat. He wanted to ask him how many children he had killed for pay. He wanted to see the light go out in those eyes, but he sat still. He was one man. There were 3 of them at the bar, and likely a dozen more scattered around town. And if this man worked for Varner, then Varner was more than just a greedy rancher. He was a man who hired butchers. "Walk away." "Jonah," a voice whispered in his head. It sounded like his father. Or maybe it was just the wind. "You are done with fighting. You have Chayton to think about. If you start a war here, you bring the army down on the few Lakota left in these hills." He forced himself to take another bite of stew. It tasted like ash. He drank the beer to wash it down, but the bitterness remained. He had come for grain. He had grain. He had coffee and lead. He needed nothing else from Red Hollow. Jonah stood up, leaving a coin on the table. He walked out of the saloon, his eyes fixed on the floor, passing within 3 feet of the man with the scar. The urge to reach out and snap the man's neck was a physical pain, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. Outside, the heat hit him again. He untied his horses, his movements jerky and rough. The roan tossed its head, sensing his mood. "Easy," Jonah murmured, but his voice lacked its usual calm. "Easy now." He led the horses down the street, intending to water them at the trough by the church before the long climb back up. As he passed the white-painted building, he saw a group of women standing in the shade of the oak tree. They were dressed in their Sunday best, though it was Tuesday. They held Bibles and parasols, their heads close together like conspiring hens. Absolutely shameless. A woman in a blue bonnet was saying, "I saw her washing clothes in the river on the Sabbath, and the way she looks at men like she is inviting them in." "She will lose that ranch," another woman said with a sniff of satisfaction. "And good riddance. It is not right for a woman to hold property when there are decent families who need the water. Besides, we all know what happened to Mr. Marsh. God does not sleep." "They say she is half witch," a third whispered, crossing herself. "Living out there near the savages. Probably lays with them too." Jonah walked past them. He did not look at them, but he felt their judgment radiating like heat from a stove. They were the pillars of the community, the moral center, and they were tearing a woman apart with their words as surely as wolves tore a deer. A widow, a poisoner, a witch, and the men in the store said Varner was going to take her land. The man in the bar said Varner paid well for fire starters. Jonah reached the water trough. He let the horses drink, watching the water ripple. He splashed some on his face, trying to wash away the image of the scar. "It is not your fight. Jonah, you saved Chayton. That is enough. You cannot save the world." He tightened the girth on his saddle. He checked his rifle one last time. He was leaving. He was going back to the high country where the only law was survival and the only judgment came from the winter storms. He would ride out, forget the scar, forget the name Varner, forget the widow with the bad luck. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. The world looked different from up here, more distant. He turned the roan's head toward the north road, toward the mountains that loomed purple and safe in the distance. "Get up," he urged the horse, and then he heard it. It was not a gunshot. It was a sound more jarring than that. It was the sound of a mob, a low, angry rumble of voices rising in a collective shout, coming from the town square, and piercing through the bass notes of the men's voices was a single, high cry. Not a scream of terror, but a shout of defiance. A woman's voice. "No, you will not take him. Get your hands off him." Jonah pulled on the reins. The roan danced, confused by the sudden check. Jonah sat there, frozen. The mountains were ahead. The trail was clear. He could be in the timber by sunset. He could be drinking coffee by a fire with Chayton in 2 days, But the cry came again. "Let him go!" And then the sound of a child crying out. Jonah looked at the mountains. They were silent, indifferent. They did not care about justice. They did not care about widows or orphans or men with scars on their arms. He looked back at the town. The dust was rising in the square. He could see people running toward the noise, like ants drawn to spilled sugar. The scar on the man's arm burned in Jonah's memory. The inverted horseshoe, the sign of the men who killed women and children. If Varner had those men, and if Varner was coming for this widow. Jonah cursed, a foul, hard word that felt like a stone in his mouth. He turned the roan around. The pack mule protested, tugging at the lead rope, but Jonah ignored it. He spurred the horse, not toward the mountains, but back toward the center of Red Hollow, back toward the noise, back toward the trouble he had sworn to avoid. He rode slowly, but his hand drifted down to loosen the leather thong over the hammer of his Sharps rifle. He was not doing this for the widow. He told himself that. He was doing it because he wanted to see the face of the man who gave the orders to the burners. He was doing it because he was a fool who did not know when to stay dead. Jonah Cade rode back into town, and the dust swirled around him like a shroud. The sun beat down, hot and unforgiving, on the back of a man who was riding away from his salvation and straight into his past. The shouting grew louder. The noise in the town square was a living thing, a beast composed of jeers, laughter, and the low, ugly rumble of mob judgment. Jonah Cade reined in his roan gelding at the edge of the crowd, his view partially obscured by the sea of hats, battered Stetsons, sweat-stained felts, and the occasional bonnet of a curious woman lingering at the periphery. The dust kicked up by 100 pairs of boots hung in the stagnant air, coating the back of his throat with the taste of grit and malice. He did not dismount immediately. From his vantage point in the saddle, he could see over the heads of the townsfolk to the center of the spectacle, a wooden platform, usually reserved for visiting politicians or Sunday preachers, had been commandeered by the law, or what passed for the law, in Red Hollow. Sheriff Briggs stood there, a man whose belly strained against the buttons of his vest and whose face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson from the heat and the power of the moment. He held a sheaf of papers in one hand, waving them like a weapon. "Order." Briggs bellowed, though he made no move to actually silence the crowd. "I said order. We are here to execute a lawful writ of foreclosure against the estate of the late Jeremiah Marsh." Two men, deputies by the look of their tin stars but thugs by the hang of their shoulders, were dragging a woman up the steps of the platform. She fought them, not with screams, but with a silent, desperate resistance, digging the heels of her worn boots into the wood planks. This was the widow. This was the woman the crones at the church had called a witch and a poisoner. Jonah looked at her, expecting to see the hardened creature described in the saloon. What he saw instead made the breath catch in his chest. Lila Marsh was young, perhaps 25 years of age. She was not a beauty in the way the saloon girls were, painted and powdered to hide the weariness. Her beauty was that of a wildflower growing in a rock crevice, stubborn, raw, and undeniable. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling in dark, heavy waves around a face that was pale with fear but set with a jaw of iron. She wore a dress of faded calico, patched carefully at the elbows and hem, clean but speaking of a poverty that ground the spirit down to the bone. But it was her eyes that held Jonah. Even from this distance, he could see they were blue, a startling, clear blue that burned with humiliation and fury. She was not crying. She refused to give them that satisfaction. A small boy, no more than 8 years of age, scrambled up the steps after her. He was thin, with knobby knees and a shock of unruly hair. Dressed in trousers that had been cut down from a man's pair, he grabbed the woman's hand, his small face twisted in a scowl of protective terror. "You leave her alone!" the boy shouted, his voice cracking. "Hush now, boy!" One of the deputies sneered, shoving the child back, though not hard enough to knock him down. Yet, Jonah felt his hand tighten on the leather reins. He told himself to stay still. He told himself this was a civil matter, a dispute over paper and ink. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat, enjoying the audience. "Lila Marsh, you have been given notice. The debt against the Marsh Ranch stands at $450. Outstanding feed bills, taxes, and the loan your husband took from Mr. Varner before his passing. The deadline is noon today. It is now 10 minutes past." "I told you," Lila said, her voice shaking but carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "I have the money for the taxes. I just need more time for the loan. The herd is scrub and bone," Briggs interrupted loudly. "And time is a luxury you do not have, unless payment is rendered in full, immediately. The property is forfeit. It will be seized and sold at public auction to satisfy the creditors." A ripple of laughter went through the men standing near the front. They were ranch hands mostly, smelling of whiskey and old sweat. "What about the widow?" one of them shouted, grinning to reveal a gap in his teeth. "Does she go with the land? I might bid $1 for her." $1 is too much for bad luck," another cried out. "But she looks sturdy enough to plow a field or warm a bed." The laughter grew louder, coarser. It was the sound of men who had forgotten their mothers and sisters, men who smelled vulnerability and wanted to tear at it. The suggestion hung heavy in the air that without land or money, Lila Marsh would have no choice but to sell the only thing she had left herself. Lila stood straighter, pulling the boy, Tommy, against her side. She looked out at the sea of faces, searching for a single ounce of mercy and finding none. Her face burned with shame, but she did not look down. Then the crowd parted. The movement was fluid, respectful, fueled by fear and money. Caleb Varner walked through the opening. He was a man who looked as if he had never sweated a day in his life, despite the relentless sun. He wore a suit of fine gray wool, a silk vest, and boots that shone like polished obsidian. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked without a limp. He was the king of Red Hollow, and he knew it. He climbed the stairs to the platform, moving with a slow, predatory grace. He stopped in front of Lila, taking off his hat to reveal hair slicked back with pomade. Sheriff, Varner said, his voice smooth as oil. "There is no need for such harshness. We are civilized men, are we not?" He turned to Lila, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. His eyes were like flat stones in a riverbed, cold and hard. "Mrs. Marsh?" Varner said softly, though the silence of the crowd allowed everyone to hear. "I take no pleasure in this. Your husband was a business associate. I do not wish to see you and the boy thrown into the street." "Then give me the extension," Lila said, her voice tight. Varner sighed, a theatrical sound of regret. "Business is business. My dear, I have investors. The railroad is coming, but—" He took a step closer to her, invading her space. "I have drawn up an alternative, a way to save your home." He pulled a folded document from his inside pocket. "A contract," Varner explained. "You sign over the water rights to the Sweetwater Fork permanently to the Varner Cattle Company. In exchange, I will absorb the debt. You and the boy may remain in the house. You will be tenants, under my protection." Lila looked at the paper, then at Varner. "Tenants," she repeated, "on my own land, and the water." "The water is too much for one woman to manage," Varner said dismissively. "I will build the dams. I will manage the flow. You will have enough for your garden." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a murmur that only those on the platform could hear clearly, but the wind carried fragments of it to Jonah's sharp ears. "And as for the rent, well, a woman alone gets lonely. I am sure we can come to a private arrangement regarding your services. I am a generous man to those who please me." Lila recoiled as if he had struck her. The implication was clear. He was not just asking for the water. He was asking for her dignity. He was proposing to make her a kept woman, a mistress in her own home, paid for with the water that ran through her land. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No, the water is the life of that valley. If you dam it, you kill everything downstream. You kill the grazing land. You kill the Indians." Varner's face hardened. You worry about savages when your own survival is at stake. Sign the paper, Lila, or get off my platform and watch me burn that shack down to clear the land." "I will not sign," she said. Varner's mask of politeness slipped. His hands shot out, grabbing her wrist. It was a violent, possessive motion. "You stupid woman," he hissed. "Let her go," Tommy screamed. The boy threw himself at Varner, hammering his small fists against the man's expensive suit coat. It happened in a heartbeat. One of Varner's hired men, a brute standing guard nearby, stepped forward and shoved the boy. It was not a gentle push. It was a hard, backhanded strike that sent the 8-year-old sprawling across the rough planks. Tommy hit the wood hard and cried out, curling into a ball. Lila screamed, trying to wrench her arm free from Varner to get to her son, but Varner held fast, twisting her arm behind her back, up on his horse. Something snapped inside Jonah Cade. The image before him, the crying child on the ground, the woman being manhandled by men with power. The dusty indifference of the crowd superimposed itself over a memory he had tried to drown in whiskey and mountain silence for 6 years. He saw the smoke. He saw the women of the Lakota village running, clutching their babies. He saw the men of the Iron Hooves laughing as they rode them down. He saw a child, no older than Tommy, fall beneath the hooves of a horse. The heat of the day seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Jonah did not think. He did not weigh the consequences. The conflict between his desire to disappear and his duty to his own soul ended the moment that boy hit the deck. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots hit the earth with a heavy, definitive thud. The crowd, sensing a change in the air, turned. They saw the mountain man. He looked like a bear that had walked out of a cave, tall, broad-shouldered, clad in buckskins that carried the scent of wild places. His face was a mask of stone, but his gray eyes were burning. He walked toward the platform. He did not hurry. He moved with a fluid, terrifying purpose. The crowd parted instantly. No one wanted to be in his way. The sheer physical presence of him, the heavy knife at his belt, the rifle in the scabbard on the horse behind him, it all spoke of violence held in check by a very thin thread. "Hold on there," Sheriff Briggs shouted, his hand dropping to his gun but not drawing it. "This is official business. Stranger." Jonah ignored him. He walked up the steps, the wood groaning slightly under his weight. He stopped 3 feet from the table where Briggs stood. Varner released Lila's wrist. Startled by the intrusion, Lila stumbled toward Tommy, dropping to her knees to gather the weeping boy into her arms. She looked up at Jonah, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Jonah did not look at her. He looked straight at Caleb Varner. "The debt," Jonah said. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder in a canyon. "How much did you say it was?" Varner straightened his coat, recovering his composure. He looked Jonah up and down with a sneer. $450, not that it concerns a drifter like—" Jonah reached into his belt. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It was stained and worn, but when it hit the table, it landed with a solid, heavy thunk that silenced the square. He untied the strings. With a flick of his wrist, he upended the pouch. Gold dust and nuggets spilled out onto the scarred wood of the table. It was raw gold, panned from cold streams high in the peaks where white men rarely dared to go. It glittered in the harsh sunlight, a stark contrast to the dust and gray wood. Alongside the gold, he tossed a small stack of crumpled banknotes. "Weigh it," Jonah said. Sheriff Briggs stared at the pile. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "I said weigh it," Jonah repeated. The sheriff fumbled for the small brass scale he kept for tax collections. His hands shook slightly as he scooped the dust onto the pan. The crowd watched in breathless silence. The only sound was the click of the weights and the soft sobbing of the boy. "It is—" Briggs cleared his throat. "It is over $500 in dust alone, plus the paper." "Take the $450, Jonah said. "Give the lady the receipt and the deed." Varner's face turned a mottled purple. "Now wait a minute. You cannot just— Who are you? You cannot just walk in here and interfere with a legal transfer?" It is a debt, Jonah said, turning his cold gaze back to Varner. Debts are paid with money. There is the money. I have a contract pending, Varner spluttered. She was about to sign. She did not sign, Jonah said. He took a step closer to Varner. Jonah was 2 inches taller and made of muscle honed by survival. Varner was soft dough wrapped in expensive cloth. And she is not going to. The debt is paid. Varner looked at the sheriff. Briggs, do something. Briggs looked at the gold. He looked at the crowd, which was now murmuring with a different tone, awe and excitement. Money talked in Red Hollow. And right now, the mountain man's money was screaming. It is legal tender, Mr. Varner, Briggs said weakly. He was corrupt, but he was not stupid enough to refuse gold in front of 100 witnesses. He quickly wrote out a receipt on a scrap of paper and stamped the foreclosure notice paid in full. Jonah took the papers. He turned to Lila. She was still on her knees, holding Tommy. She stared up at him, stunned. She looked at the gold on the table, then at the man who had thrown it there as if it were dirt. There was gratitude in her eyes. Yes, but there was also a sharp, defensive wariness. She was a woman who had learned that nothing in this world was free. Jonah held the papers out to her. Take it, he said gently. The rumble in his voice softened just a fraction. Lila stood up slowly. She brushed the dust from her skirt. She did not take the papers immediately. She searched his face, looking for the catch, looking for the demand that would follow. Why? She asked. Her voice was hoarse. I do not know you. I cannot pay you back. I did not ask you to, Jonah said. He pressed the papers into her hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from work, but warm. Take the boy. Go home. She gripped the papers tight, clutching them to her chest like a shield. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. She looked at Varner with a sudden, fierce triumph, then turned and grabbed Tommy's hand. Come on, Tommy, we are leaving. She led the boy down the steps, holding her head high. The crowd parted for her this time, not out of scorn, but out of sheer confusion. Jonah watched them go until they disappeared around the corner of the livery stable. He felt a strange emptiness in his chest, lighter but aching. That was his winter supplies. That was his ammunition. That was the money for a new rifle. Gone. He turned back to the table. Briggs was sweeping the gold into a lockbox. Varner was still standing there. He was vibrating with rage. His plan to control the river, to squeeze the valley dry, had been thwarted by a stranger in a buckskins. He stepped close to Jonah. He smelled of bay rum and hate. You have made a mistake, mountain man, Varner said. His voice a low hiss meant only for Jonah. You think you are a hero, you just bought yourself a war. Jonah looked at him calmly. He saw the greed in Varner's eyes. He saw the cruelty. And he saw the shadow of the men with the branded arms standing behind him. I did not buy anything, Jonah said. I just paid a bill. Go back to your mountain, Varner threatened, poking a finger toward Jonah's chest, though he stopped short of touching the buckskin. Ride out today, because if you stick around, you are going to find that Red Hollow is a very dangerous place for strangers. Do not get involved in the business of a widow on my land. It is her land, Jonah corrected him. Not for long. Varner smiled, a thin, ugly expression. Accidents happen. Barns burn. People disappear. Jonah leaned in. He did not shout. He did not posture. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had hunted predators in the dark. If anything happens to her, Jonah said softly, or the boy, I will not come for the sheriff. I will come for you. He turned his back on Varner, a calculated insult, and walked down the steps. The crowd watched him, silent and wary. He walked to his horse, checked the cinch, and swung into the saddle. He could feel Varner's eyes boring into his back. He could feel the shift in the town's atmosphere. He had kicked the hornet's nest. As he turned the roan back toward the livery to retrieve his mule and what little supplies he had already bought, Jonah knew one thing for certain. He was not leaving Red Hollow today. He had paid the debt, but the account was not yet settled. The scar on the arm of the man in the saloon, the fear in the boy's eyes, The defiance in the widow's face, it was all connected. Jonah Cade had ridden into town for grain. He was now holding the line for a woman he did not know, against a man who owned everything. He touched the brim of his hat to no one in particular and rode slowly down the main street, the setting sun casting a long, dark shadow before him. The game had begun. The ride out to the Marsh Ranch was a silent affair. The sun was dipping low, painting the western sky in bruises of purple and angry orange. Jonah Cade rode a few lengths behind the buckboard wagon, his rifle resting easy across his saddle horn, his eyes scanning the ridge line. He was not looking for scenery. He was looking for ambush. Lila Marsh sat stiff-backed on the wagon seat, snapping the reins over the back of her tired mare. The boy, Tommy, sat beside her, twisting around every few seconds to look at the mountain man who trailed them like a dark shadow. When they finally crested the last rise and looked down into the valley cut by the Sweetwater Fork, Jonah understood why Caleb Varner wanted this land. It was a jewel. Even in the dying light, the ribbon of water shimmered, and the grass along its banks was thick and green, a stark contrast to the dust-choked scrub of the high plains. But as they drew closer, the beauty gave way to the scars of a siege. The split-rail fence that marked the property line was broken in 3 places. The rails dragged off and splintered. The main barn stood, but one side was blackened by soot, the result of a fire that had been doused hastily. The corral was empty save for a single milk cow that looked skittish and thin. Lila pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house. It was a modest structure of rough-hewn logs and chinking, the porch sagging on the left side. She climbed down, her movements heavy with exhaustion. "You do not have to stay," she said, not looking at Jonah. She began to unhitch the mare. "You paid the debt. That is more than enough." Jonah dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked over and took the harness from her hands. "I will see to the animals," he said. His voice was low, leaving no room for argument. "Get the boy inside. Do not light a lamp until the shutters are closed." Lila hesitated, her blue eyes searching his face in the gloom. She looked like she wanted to argue, to assert the independence she had fought so hard to keep, but the weariness won out. She nodded once, took Tommy's hand, and retreated into the house. Jonah worked in the dark. He rubbed down the mare, his roan, and the pack mule, speaking to them in soft murmurs. The silence of the ranch was heavy. It was not the peaceful silence of the mountains. It was the silence of a place holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. He intended to sleep in the barn, keep one eye open, and be gone by dawn. He had done his good deed. He had balanced the scales, but as he walked the perimeter of the yard, checking the sight lines, a shadow detached itself from the tree line near the creek. Jonah did not reach for his gun. He had felt the presence 10 minutes ago, a prickle on the back of his neck that he knew well. "You are far from the snow line, brother," a voice said. Chayton stepped into the moonlight. He was a tall man, built like a whipcord, his hair black as a raven's wing and braided with strips of red flannel. He wore buckskin similar to Jonah's, but beaded with the geometric patterns of the Lakota. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in one hand. "Needed grain," Jonah said, leaning against a fence post. "You bought more than grain today," Chayton replied. He walked closer, his moccasins making no sound on the earth. "I heard the drums in the town. You paid gold for the white woman. You shamed the cattleman. He was going to hurt the boy." Chayton looked toward the dark house. "The boy is not your blood. The woman is not your kin. This land," he swept a hand toward the creek, "was the winter camp of my father's father. The spirits here do not know the name Marsh, and they do not know the name Varner. But now you stand between them." Jonah took a piece of tobacco from his pocket and bit off a corner. "Varner takes the water. He kills the valley. Your people hunt downriver. If the creek dries up, the game moves on." "So you fight for the Lakota?" Chayton asked, a sharp edge to his voice. "Or do you fight because she has eyes like the summer sky?" Jonah spat onto the ground. "I fight because a man with a branded arm was in that saloon. Iron hooves. Chayton went still. The playfulness vanished from his face, replaced by a predator's intensity. You are sure? Saw the mark myself. Upside-down horseshoe. Burned deep. Chayton hissed a breath through his teeth. Then the war is coming whether we wish it or not. If Varner has hired the butchers, he intends to leave no one standing. Not the woman, not us. He looked at Jonah, his dark eyes serious. You are walking into a storm. Jonah, if you stay here, you bring the lightning down on this house. If I leave, they burn it tomorrow, Jonah said. Then sleep light. Brother, Chayton said. He turned back toward the trees. I will watch the North Ridge. But do not think a bag of gold makes you a rancher. You are a mountain man. You belong to the high places. Chayton vanished as quickly as he had arrived, melting into the darkness. Jonah stood alone for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. He was trapped by his conscience, trapped by the past, and trapped by the ghost of a massacre he had failed to stop 6 years ago. The next morning brought a heat that sat on the valley like a wool blanket. Jonah did not leave at dawn. He walked out to the barn and saw the chaotic state of the ranch in the harsh light of day. The roof of the chicken coop was caved in. The gate to the pasture hung by a single leather hinge. He found a hammer and a bag of nails in the workshop. He took off his buckskin jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his undershirt, and set to work. Lila came out onto the porch an hour later, holding a mug of coffee. She watched him for a long moment as he drove a nail into the fence post with a single, efficient strike. She walked over, extending the mug. I thought you would be halfway to the pass by now, she said. Jonah took the coffee. It was black and strong. Horse through a shoe. He lied smoothly. Need to reset it. Might as well fix this gate while the iron heats. Lila crossed her arms. The morning sun caught the stray wisps of hair escaping her braid. Why are you doing this? And do not tell me it is about the horse. I saw you check his hooves last night. They are fine. Jonah took a sip of the coffee. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was tired. Yes, but she stood her ground like a soldier. Varner wants this place, Jonah said. He thinks he can scare you off. If he sees a man working the fence, seeing to the stock, he might think twice about sending his boys to light fires. So you are a scarecrow? Lila asked, a dry humor touching her lips. I have been called worse. I cannot pay you wages, she said, her voice dropping. I have nothing left. The gold you paid, that was a fortune. I do not understand why a stranger would do that. Jonah looked past her to where Tommy was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a stick with a dull kitchen knife. I am not asking for wages, Jonah said. But if you are going to hold this land, you need to be ready. Varner is not going to stop because I threw some dust on a table. He finished the coffee and handed the mug back. Send the boy over here. Lila stiffened. Why? He is holding that knife like he wants to cut his own thumb off, and if Varner comes back, the boy needs to know which end of a pistol makes the loud noise. Lila hesitated, her maternal instinct flaring, but she looked at the broken horizon and nodded. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that Jonah had not expected. He worked from sunup to sundown. He repaired the roof of the coop. He cleared the brush that had grown too close to the house, creating a firebreak. He cleaned the well, pulling up buckets of mud until the water ran clear again. And he taught Tommy. He took the boy to the edge of the creek, setting up tin cans on a log. He placed his heavy Colt revolver in the boy's small hands, standing behind him, wrapping his own large hands over Tommy's to steady the weight. Do not jerk the trigger, Jonah instructed, his voice low and patient. Squeeze it, like you are shaking a hand you do not want to let go of. The gun roared, kicking up, and Tommy flinched, but the tin can flew off the log. The boy looked up at Jonah, his eyes shining with a mixture of terror and absolute worship. Did you see that? Tommy shouted. Mama, did you see? Lila was watching from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was not smiling, but the tightness around her eyes had softened. She saw how Jonah stood between the boy and the recoil. She saw how he never raised his voice, how he treated the boy not as a nuisance, but as a man in the making. Trust was a slow-growing crop, but it was taking root. On the fourth evening, after a supper of cornbread and beans, Jonah sat on the porch steps, rolling a cigarette. His shoulder, the left one, was throbbing. He had wrenched it lifting a support beam in the barn, aggravating the old injury. He rubbed at it unconsciously, grimacing. The screen door creaked. Lila stepped out. She held a basin of warm water and a roll of clean linen. "Take your shirt off," she said. Jonah froze. "It is fine, ma'am, just a stiffness. I watched you wince every time you lifted the hammer this afternoon," she said. "And I'm not going to have you crippled on my porch. Take it off." Jonah sighed and unbuttoned his Henley. He peeled the fabric down, exposing the hard slabs of muscle on his chest and back. His skin was a map of scars, white lines from knife cuts, round puckers from punctures. But the one on his shoulder was the worst. It was an ugly, knotted mass of tissue where a bullet had shattered the collarbone and healed badly. Lila drew in a sharp breath when she saw it. She dipped a cloth in the water and stepped closer. "This is old," she murmured, touching the skin gently. Her fingers were cool against his fevered flesh. 6 years, Jonah said, staring out into the darkness. "War," she asked. "Massacre," he corrected. "Lakota village, north of here. I was scouting for the army then. Thought I was keeping the peace. I was wrong." Lila washed the area, the smell of a lye soap rising between them. She was close, dangerously close. Jonah could smell the scent of her flower, wind, and a faint, sweet note of lavender water. He could feel the heat of her body radiating against his bare back. "You blame yourself," she said softly. It was not a question. "I was late," Jonah said, his voice rough. "I got there in time to bury the dead, not to save them." Lila moved around to face him. She began to wrap the bandage, her arms reaching around his torso. For a moment, it felt like an embrace. Her face was inches from his. He looked up, and her eyes were dark and wide. The air between them crackled with a sudden, intense charge. It was not just gratitude. It was the raw, undeniable pull of two lonely people who recognized the damage in each other. Jonah's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into the space between his knees, to taste the sadness on her lips. Lila's breath hitched. Her hand rested on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating. "Jonah," she whispered. He caught her wrist. His grip was gentle but firm. He stopped her hand. "Lila," he said, using her name for the first time. "I am a drifter. I have blood on my hands that will not wash off. You are a decent woman." "I am a widow that the town calls a witch," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I think we are past decent." "No," Jonah said. He released her wrist slowly. "Not yet." He stood up, grabbing his shirt. The moment broke, leaving them both breathless and aching with what had almost happened. "Get inside," he said, his voice gruff to cover the tremble in it. "Lock the door." The following day, the reality of their situation arrived not with a bang, but with silence. The delivery wagon from the general store, which usually brought flour and sugar on Fridays, did not come. When Jonah rode out to check the road, he found the bridge over the dry gulch had been sawed through. Lila returned from the garden with a face like thunder. "They burned the hayfield," she said, throwing her bonnet onto the table. "The south pasture, it is black. If the wind had been blowing the other way, it would have taken the house." "Varner," Jonah said. He was cleaning his rifle at the table. "And the rumors," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Mrs. Higgins rode by on her buggy." She did not stop, but she shouted. She asked if I was charging the mountain man by the hour or by the night. Jonah's hand stilled on the gun stock. "They are trying to break you, make you feel so small, you crawl away." "I am not crawling," Lila said fiercely. "This is my home, Tommy's home." "Good," Jonah said. He snapped the action of the sharps shut. "Because tonight, They are going to stop throwing words and start throwing lead. The sun went down, and the valley plunged into an ink-black darkness. There was no moon. Jonah extinguished every lamp in the house. He positioned Lila and Tommy in the root cellar, a small dugout beneath the kitchen floorboards. "Stay down here," he told them. "No matter what you hear, do not come out until I open the door." "Jonah!" Lila grabbed his sleeve. She looked terrified, but her grip was strong. "Be careful." He nodded once and closed the trap door. He took up his position at the window facing the main road. He had broken out the glass earlier to keep splinters from flying. He waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, the sound of hooves. Not galloping, but walking. Careful. Jonah rested the heavy octagonal barrel of the sharps on the sill. He peered into the gloom. He saw shapes moving near the gate. 3 riders, maybe 4. A voice called out from the dark. "Hey there, widow, you in there warm and cozy with your stray dog?" Laughter, crude and sharp. "Come on out, Lila," another voice shouted. "We just want to talk, mister. Varner sent us to give you a housewarming present." A bottle arced through the air. It smashed against the porch railing. The smell of kerosene filled the air, followed instantly by the flare of a match. Flames licked up the dry wood of the railing. "Fire!" one of the men shouted. Whooping. Jonah did not hesitate. He did not aim for the men, not yet. He aimed for the ground, 3 feet in front of the lead horse. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps 50-90 roared like a cannon. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second. The heavy lead slug slammed into the earth with a force that sprayed dirt and gravel into the faces of the horses. The animals panicked, rearing and screaming. The riders cursed, fighting to stay in their saddles. "That is the warning," Jonah shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Next one takes a head off. He has got a buffalo gun," one of the men screamed, wrestling his mount around. A shot rang out from the riders, wild and desperate. The bullet thudded into the log wall a foot from Jonah's head, sending a spray of bark into his hair. Jonah chambered another round, the metallic clack-clack of the lever action loud in the small room. He aimed again. This time, he put a bullet through the water trough next to the riders, shattering the wood and sending a geyser of water into the air. "Go back to Varner," Jonah bellowed. "Tell him the price just went up." The riders did not wait for a third invitation. They spurred their horses, vanishing into the night, leaving the small fire burning on the porch. Jonah rushed out. Grabbing a blanket from the bench, he beat the flames out, his breath coming in short, hard gasps. The fire died, leaving a blackened scar on the wood. He stood there in the smoking silence, the heavy rifle hot in his hands. This was not a debt collection anymore. This was not a property dispute. The first shots had been fired in anger. The line had been crossed. Jonah looked toward the dark tree line where he knew Chayton was watching. He looked down at the trap door where a woman and a child were hiding in the dirt. He had come for grain. He had stayed for honor. Now, he would kill for survival. The war for the Sweetwater had begun. The dust from the previous night's gunfire had barely settled when the law arrived. It was mid-morning, and the heat was already rising in shimmering waves off the hard-packed earth of the yard. Sheriff Briggs did not come alone this time. He brought 2 deputies, men with shotguns resting casually across their saddles, and he brought a piece of paper that carried more weight than lead. Jonah was by the well, sharpening an axe. He did not stand up when the horses stopped. He kept the stone moving in slow, rhythmic circles against the steel blade. "Morning, Sheriff," Jonah said, his voice flat. Briggs shifted his bulk in the saddle. He looked at the charred railing of the porch, then at Jonah. "There were reports of shots fired last night. Cade, disturbing the peace, reckless discharge of firearms, just clearing out some coyotes," Jonah said, testing the edge of the axe with his thumb. "Big ones, 2-legged variety. You are treading a fine line," Briggs warned, his face slick with sweat. "Mister, Varner is a respected businessman. If his men were here, they were likely just checking on the welfare of the widow. And you shot at them." Lila stepped out onto the porch. She held Tommy's hands so tight her knuckles were white. "They threw a firebomb. Sheriff, they tried to burn the house down with us inside." Briggs looked at her, and for a moment, there was a flicker of shame in his eyes. But it was quickly extinguished by the reality of who paid his salary. "That is your word against theirs, Mrs. Marsh, but that is not why I am here." He unfolded the paper. "I have a concern filed with the county regarding the welfare of the child," Briggs said, his voice taking on an officious tone. "Living in a house targeted by violence, with a drifter of no fixed address residing on the premises. It is not a suitable environment. The judge agrees. If there is one more incident, just one, I have orders to take the boy into protective custody until the court decides his future." Lila made a sound like she had been punched in the gut. She swayed, grabbing the porch post for support. "You cannot take my son. I can, and I will," Briggs said. "For his own safety. And there is another matter. Mr. Varner has petitioned the district court for an easement, the Railway Act of 1862. He claims the water is necessary for public commerce. The hearing is in 2 weeks. Until then, this land is under provisional review. If you cannot maintain order here, the state will intervene." "It is a land grab," Jonah said. Standing up, he gripped the axe handle. "And you know it. It is the law," Briggs snapped. He turned his horse. "You are a relic. Cade. You think a rifle solves everything, but the world has changed. Ink is stronger than gunpowder now. You best remember that." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence that felt like a tomb. Lila sat down heavily on the steps. She pulled Tommy into her lap, burying her face in his hair. She was not crying. She was shaking with a terror that went deeper than tears. Losing the land was one thing. Losing Tommy was the end of her world. "They are going to take him," she whispered. "No," Jonah said. He drove the axe into the chopping block with a savage swing. "They are not." An hour later, Chayton appeared. He did not use the gate. He simply stepped out of the cottonwoods near the creek, as if he had grown from the earth itself. He looked grim. Jonah met him by the barn. "Tell me." "The Iron Hooves," Chayton said, his voice low. "They are camped in the Box Canyon, 3 miles east. 12 men, heavily armed. I saw the brand on the sentry." Jonah felt the old rage burn in his gut, but he pushed it down. "What is the play?" "They wait for the moon to turn dark," Chayton explained. 2 nights from now, they will not just burn the porch. They plan to slaughter the stock and burn the house. They will leave a Lakota arrow in the doorframe. Varner will use it to call the cavalry. He will say the savages and the mountain man have joined forces to terrorize the valley. The army will come, kill us, remove the woman, and Varner gets the water. It was a clean, brutal plan. It solved all of Varner's problems at once. "We cannot hold the ranch," Jonah said. "Not against 12 men and the law." "No," Chayton agreed. "If we fight here, the boy dies in the crossfire, or the sheriff takes him." Jonah looked back at the house. Lila was inside, packing a trunk with shaking hands. She was preparing to run, but she had nowhere to go. "We go up," Jonah said, looking at the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Range that loomed in the distance. "To the old trapper cabin near the Eagle's Nest. The air is thin there, the trail is narrow. 100 men could not take that pass if 2 good rifles held it." "And the woman?" Chayton asked. "She is soft. Brother, the mountain does not care about her grief." "She is stronger than she looks," Jonah said, "and she has no choice." The departure was not a stealthy retreat in the dead of night. Jonah decided that if they were going to leave, they would do it with their heads high. They needed supplies that the ranch could not provide: thick wool blankets, dried meat, ammunition, and medicines. They had to go through Red Hollow to get to the mountain trail. Jonah saddled the roan and the mare. He packed the mule until it groaned. "We ride through town," Jonah told Lila. "We buy what we need. We let them see us leaving. Let Varner think he has won. Let him think he scared us off. It will make him careless." Lila nodded. She wore her best riding skirt, though it was frayed at the hem, and a heavy shawl. She lifted Tommy up. "Put him with me," Jonah said. Lila hesitated, then lifted the boy. Jonah swung into the saddle, pulling Tommy up to sit in front of him. The boy was small and warm against Jonah's chest. Jonah wrapped one arm around him, holding the reins with the other. "Climb on behind me," Jonah said to Lila. "I can ride the mare," she said. "We need the mare for the packs." Jonah lied. He wanted her close. He wanted her within reach if a shot rang out. "Get on." Lila placed her foot in the stirrup. Jonah reached down, gripping her forearm to hoist her up. She settled behind the saddle, her arms going around his waist. She hesitated for a second, leaving a polite distance, then realized the absurdity of it. She pressed herself against his back, her hands locking together on his stomach. Jonah felt the heat of her, the curve of her body against his spine. It sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with danger. They rode out of the ranch gate and turned onto the main road toward Red Hollow. When they entered the town, the midday sun was high and unforgiving. The street was busy. People stopped. Silence rippled outward from their passing like a wave. It was a sight that would be talked about in Red Hollow for 50 years. The mountain man, grim and towering, riding his war horse, the widow's son protected in his arms, and the widow herself, the woman they had called a witch, clinging to him not like a captive, but like a partner. Jonah stared straight ahead. He looked at no one. His expression was stone. Lila felt the eyes of the town on her. She saw Mrs. Higgins standing by the milliner's shop, mouth agape. She saw the men in front of the saloon, the same ones who had jeered at her. For years, she had walked this street with her head down, ashamed of her poverty, ashamed of the lies they told about her. But today, she felt the solid, unyielding strength of the man beneath her. She smelled the scent of him leather, gun oil, and pine. He was a fortress. She did not look down. She tightened her hold on Jonah, pressing her cheek against the rough buckskin of his jacket. Let them look. Let them whisper. For the first time since her husband died, she was not alone. They stopped at the general store. Jonah did not dismount. He tossed a bag of coins to the storekeep who came out, nervous and sweating. "Flour," Jonah ordered. "Bacon, coffee, and 2 heavy buffalo robes. Bring them out." They waited in the street while the goods were loaded onto the mule. Varner stepped out of his office across the street. He stood on the boardwalk, smoking a cigar, watching them with a smug satisfaction. "Leaving so soon?" Varner called out. "Smart choice. Cade, the mountains are safer for your kind." Jonah looked at him. He did not smile. He did not threaten. He just stared until Varner shifted uncomfortably and looked away. "Yeah," Jonah said to the horse. They rode past the sheriff's office, past the church, and up the winding trail that led out of the valley. They were leaving the world of laws and lies behind. They were climbing into the sky. The cabin was a small, rough structure wedged into a cleft of rock at 8,000 feet. It had been built by a trapper 40 years ago and abandoned to the elements. The roof leaked. The chinking was gone in places, and a family of raccoons had to be evicted upon arrival. It was cold up here. The wind howled through the pines with a lonely, mournful sound. By the time they had unpacked and secured the animals in a makeshift lean-to, the sky had turned a bruised purple. A storm was rolling in fast, a late summer squall that promised ice and misery. Inside the cabin, there was a stone fireplace and a single sleeping platform built against the wall. The mattress was a tick stuffed with old straw, smelling of dust. Jonah got a fire roaring in the hearth. The light danced on the log walls, chasing back the shadows. "I will sleep on the porch," Jonah said, taking one of the buffalo robes. Lila looked at him. She was shivering, despite the fire. "It is freezing out there, Jonah, and the rain is starting. I have slept in snowdrifts deeper than you are tall," he said, moving toward the door. "I will be fine." As he opened the door, a sheet of icy rain lashed against him. The wind screamed, nearly tearing the heavy wood from his grip. It was not just a storm. It was a tempest. Lila crossed the room and grabbed his arm. "Do not be a fool," You will freeze to death, and then who will protect us? Close the door." Jonah looked at her. He looked at the single narrow mattress. He looked at the storm. He closed the door. They ate a supper of hard biscuits and jerky in silence. Tommy fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on a pile of blankets near the hearth, exhausted by the ride and the thin air. That left Jonah and Lila, and the one mattress. "You take the bed," Jonah said. "I will sit by the fire." "Jonah," Lila said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made him look at her. She was standing by the fire, her hair loose around her shoulders. The firelight softened the lines of worry on her face. "You are exhausted. Your shoulder is hurting. I can see you favoring it. We are two grown people. We can share a mattress without sin." Jonah swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "Lila, I am a man. You are a woman. And it is a small bed. I trust you," she said simply. Those 3 words disarmed him more completely than any weapon. They lay down on the straw mattress. It was narrow. There was no way to avoid contact. Lila lay on her side, facing the wall. Jonah lay with his back to her, facing the room, his Colt revolver within reach on the floorboards. They pulled the heavy buffalo robe over them, under the fur. The heat began to build. Outside, the wind battered the cabin, a chaotic fury. Inside, the silence was charged with a different kind of electricity. Jonah lay rigid, every muscle tensed. He could feel the length of her back against his. He could feel the curve of her hips, the warmth of her legs. He could smell the soap she had used that morning, a faint, clean scent that cut through the wood smoke. He closed his eyes, fighting a battle that was harder than any skirmish with the iron hooves. He wanted to turn. He wanted to pull her against him, to bury his face in her neck, to find comfort in the softness of her. He had been alone for so long. The solitude of the mountains, which usually felt like freedom, suddenly felt like a prison. Lila lay with her eyes open, staring at the logs. She could hear Jonah's breathing slow, controlled, but heavy. She could feel the tension radiating off him. She was afraid, yes, but not of him. She was afraid of the feelings unfurling in her chest. She had loved her husband, but it had been a safe, quiet love. This pull toward the man beside her was wild and terrifying. She shifted slightly, seeking his warmth. Her hand, hidden beneath the robe, moved. Her fingers brushed against his hand where it rested on the mattress. Jonah did not pull away. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then, slowly, his fingers uncurled. His rough, scarred hand covered hers. He gave it a gentle squeeze, acknowledging her, acknowledging the moment. He did not turn. He did not try to take more. He just held her hand in the darkness, an anchor in the storm. "Good night, Lila," he whispered, his voice rough. "Good night, Jonah," she breathed. They lay there, hand in hand, backs touching, while the storm raged outside. It was the most intimate moment of Jonah's life. The morning broke cold and clear. The sunlight struck the snow-capped peaks, turning them a blinding white. Jonah was up before dawn, tending to the horses. When he came back in, Lila was frying bacon over the fire. The domesticity of the scene hit him hard. It felt right, and that terrified him. A shadow fell across the open doorway. Chayton stood there. He had tracked them through the storm, moving like a ghost. He looked at Jonah, then at Lila, then at the single mattress that still bore the impression of 2 bodies. He stepped inside, his face impassive, but his eyes sharp. "The coffee smells good," Chayton said. "Pour a cup," Jonah said, pouring water into the basin to wash his face. Chayton took the tin cup Lila offered him. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she moved around Jonah, comfortable, familiar. Then he turned to Jonah. "The iron hooves are moving," Chayton said. "They will strike the ranch tonight, but they have left 2 men in town to watch the sheriff." Jonah dried his face with a rough towel. "Then we have work to do." Chayton walked with Jonah out to the horses, out of the earshot of the cabin. "You are digging a deep hole, brother," Chayton said quietly. "I see how you look at her. and I see how she looks at you. She is under my protection, Jonah said defensively. She is more than that, Chayton countered. If you take this woman, you choose a side. You become a man of the valley, a man of fences and laws. You cannot be a mountain man and a husband. The two spirits will tear you apart. I am not looking for a wife, Jonah said, though the words tasted like ash. The heart does not ask permission, Chayton said. He adjusted his rifle strap. But remember this, if we fail tonight, there is no future for anyone, white or Lakota. Jonah nodded. He looked back at the cabin. Lila was standing in the doorway, watching them. She looked small against the vastness of the mountain, but she stood tall. We do not fail, Jonah said. Then we ride, Chayton said. We go down. We find the wolves in their den, and we bring the proof that Briggs cannot ignore. Jonah walked back to the porch. Lila was waiting. You are going, she said. We have to, Jonah said. We need to get close to their camp. Hear them, maybe catch one. If we can prove Varner hired them, Briggs has to act. And if you do not come back, she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jonah reached out. He touched her cheek with the back of his knuckles. It was a brief, tender gesture. Keep the rifle loaded, he said. If anyone comes up that trail who is not me or Chayton, you shoot. You do not ask questions. You shoot. She nodded, covering his hand with hers for a second before he pulled away. Jonah mounted the roan. He and Chayton turned their horses toward the steep, winding trail that led back down into the Valley of Death. They were hunters now, descending from the clouds to stalk the predators in the grass. The mountain man rode away, leaving his heart in a cabin at the top of the world, riding toward a war that would decide if he ever got to reclaim it. The sun was bleeding out over the western ridge by the time Jonah and Chayton reached the tree line overlooking the river bend. The air here lay heavy and humid, smelling of damp earth and rotting willow leaves. It was a smell Jonah Cade knew well. It was the smell of a graveyard. 6 years ago. This stretch of the Sweetwater Fork had been a winter camp for the Lakota. Jonah remembered where the teepees had stood, arranged in a circle to block the wind. He remembered the sound of children playing in the shallows. Now, the ground was overgrown with tall grass, but to Jonah's eyes, the earth was still stained, and now, new ghosts were walking on the graves of the old. Below them, tucked against a sheer rock face that offered protection from the wind, was the camp of the Iron Hooves. There were 12 men, just as Chayton had tracked. Their horses were picketed on a long line, grazing on the lush grass that Lila Marsh was fighting to save. Jonah lay flat on his belly, peering through a gap in the brush. His heart hammered against his ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of rage. He saw the man with the branded arm, the one from the saloon. He was sitting on a log, sharpening a Bowie knife, laughing at something another man said. "It is hallowed ground," Chayton whispered, lying beside Jonah. "And they spit on it." "They are going to do more than spit," Jonah murmured. The wind shifted, carrying voices up the slope. "Varner wants it done tonight," the branded man said. His voice was gravel and smoke. "Moon is down. We ride to the ranch, torch the barn first, then the house. Make sure you kill the milk cow and leave it by the gate with a couple of Lakota arrows sticking out of it." "What about the woman?" another man asked. "If she is there, she dies," the leader said with a shrug. "If she ran off with the mountain man, even better. Varner says if the house burns and we make it look like an Indian raid, he can call in the cavalry from Fort Robinson. They will sweep these hills clean. The mountain man gets hanged for aiding hostiles, the widow loses the land, and Varner gets his water." Jonah's hand tightened on the stock of his Sharps rifle until the wood creaked. It was a perfect, evil circle. Varner was not just stealing land. He was orchestrating a war to cover his theft. "I can drop him from here," Jonah whispered. 300 yards, no wind. "And then what?" Chayton hissed, placing a hand on the barrel of the gun. "You kill one. The other 11 scatter. They ride to the ranch and burn it anyway. Or they ride to town and say you ambushed them. We have no proof. Jonah, dead men tell no tales, but they also sign no confessions. "So we watch," Jonah demanded, his voice tight. "While they plan to murder a woman and a boy." "We need the sheriff," Chayton said. "We need Briggs to see this, to see Varner's dogs on this land, armed for war." "Briggs is in Varner's pocket." "Briggs is a coward," Chayton corrected. "But he fears the army more than he fears Varner. If he sees the truth, he will turn." It was a gamble, a terrible one. But before they could argue further, a sound drifted down from the north, not from the camp, but from the direction of the pass they had just left. Jonah turned his head. High up, miles away near the Eagle's Nest cabin, a thin column of black smoke was rising against the twilight sky. "The cabin?" Jonah breathed. "No," Chayton said, squinting. "It is too small for the cabin. It is a signal fire or—" Jonah went cold. "She saw the smoke from the valley. She thinks the ranch is already burning. Lila. She had been watching the valley with a hawk's intensity all day. If she saw a farmer burning brush and mistook it for her home—" "She will try to go back," Jonah said, pushing himself up. "She will think she has to save what is left." "She would not leave the safety of the high ground," Chayton argued. "She is smart. She is a mother," Jonah said. "And that ranch is the only thing her husband left her. She is not thinking about safety. She is thinking about legacy." He did not wait for Chayton's agreement. He scrambled back from the ridge, moving fast and low until he reached the horses. Jonah was right. Halfway down the mountain trail, where the path narrowed between two boulders, they found the sign, fresh hoof prints, the mare's shoes, and beside them, the smaller prints of the pony Tommy rode. They were heading down, back toward the valley, but 50 yards further down, the story changed. The tracks were obliterated by the heavy, churning prints of shod war horses. There were scuff marks in the dirt. A child's hat lay in the dust, trampled flat. Jonah slid off the roan and picked up the hat. It was Tommy's. "They were waiting," Jonah said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. "Varner had men watching the trail." "They did not kill them here," Chayton said, examining the ground. "No blood. They took them." "To the camp," Jonah said. He threw the hat down and vaulted back into the saddle. "They took them to the river." He spurred the horse, blind fury taking the reins. He was going to ride into that camp and kill every living thing that stood on two legs. He did not care about the law. He did not care about proof. He cared about the woman who had held his hand in the dark and the boy he had taught to shoot. "Jonah!" Chayton shouted, kicking his horse to catch up. He grabbed Jonah's bridle, forcing the roan to a halt. "Stop, think. Get off my horse. Chayton!" Jonah snarled. "They have them. And if you ride in there screaming, they will slit her throat before you fire a second shot," Chayton yelled back. "There are 12 of them. You are one man. You want to die, brother, or do you want to save her?" Jonah trembled, the adrenaline shaking his frame. He looked at Chayton, his eyes wild. "They are going to hurt them." "Yes," Chayton said calmly, "unless we are smarter than them. You cannot be the hammer today. Jonah, you have to be the knife." Chayton pointed toward the ridges surrounding the river basin. "I will ride to the caves. My cousins are there. 6 warriors. We cannot attack the whites without bringing the cavalry down on us, but we can make them think the whole Sioux nation has arrived. We will surround the camp. We will make noise. We will create fear." "And while they are looking at the shadows," Jonah asked, his breathing slowing. "You go into the water," Chayton said. "You swim. You come up behind the tents. You get the woman and the boy. When you have them clear, you fire 1 shot. Then we rain hell on them." It was a desperate plan. It relied on timing, on luck, and on the darkness holding. "Go," Jonah said. The night had fully descended by the time Jonah slipped into the Sweetwater Fork a mile upstream. The water was icy, shocking the breath from his lungs, but it numbed the pain in his shoulder. He let the current carry him, keeping his head low, drifting like a log toward the glow of the fires. He pulled himself into the reeds 20 feet from the riverbank. The camp was loud. Whiskey bottles were being passed around. The men felt safe. They felt powerful. In the center of the camp, near the largest fire, Caleb Varner sat on a folding camp chair. He looked entirely out of place in his fine suit among the filth of the mercenaries, but he held court like a king. Lila was there. She was tied to a stake driven into the ground. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her hair was wild, her dress torn at the shoulder, but her head was up. Tommy was nowhere to be seen, likely tied in one of the tents. Jonah watched, water dripping from his hair, his knife held in his teeth. He needed to get closer. Varner stood up and walked over to Lila. He held a tin cup of coffee. "You are a stubborn woman, Lila," Varner said. His voice carried over the water. "I offer you a life of comfort. I offer to pay your debts, and you run off to the mountains with a savage. He is twice the man you are," Lila spat. Varner chuckled, tossing the contents of the cup into the fire. It hissed violently. "Is he? Where is he now, hiding in a cave while you sit here?" He crouched down, grabbing her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Here is the new deal. You sign the deed tonight. You admit to the sheriff that you were coerced by the mountain man, that he kidnapped you. Do that, and the boy lives. I will even send him to a nice boarding school in the east. You stay here, with me." "I would rather see you dead," Lila said. "That can be arranged," Varner whispered, leaning in. "But not for me, for the boy. My friend over there, the one with the scar. He likes children. He finds them entertaining." Lila struggled against the ropes, a sound of pure animal panic escaping her throat. Varner stood up. "You have 1 hour. Then the entertainment begins." Jonah moved. He did not come out of the water like a hero. He came out like a snake. He belly-crawled through the mud, using the noise of the drinking men to cover his approach. He reached the back of the supply tent. He slashed the canvas with his knife and slipped inside. Tommy was there, gagged and bound hand and foot, his eyes wide with terror. Jonah put a finger to his lips. He cut the boy's bonds swiftly. "Can you run?" Jonah whispered. Tommy nodded frantically. "Go to the river," Jonah commanded softly. "Float downstream. Do not stop until you hit the bend. Hide in the willows." "Mama," Tommy mouthed. "I am getting her. Go!" He pushed the boy through the slit in the tent. He waited a beat, ensuring the boy was gone. Then he turned his eyes toward the fire. Outside, the wind suddenly picked up. A coyote howled, but it was not a coyote. It was a Lakota signal. From the darkness of the surrounding hills, a gunshot cracked. A mercenary standing guard by the horses dropped his bottle, clutching his leg. "Indians!" someone screamed. "We are surrounded!" Chaos erupted. The mercenaries scrambled for their rifles, kicking over the fire, diving for cover. The horses, spooked by the smell of blood and the noise, tore at their picket lines. Varner stood frozen, looking around wildly. "Hold your fire. See what we are dealing with." Another shot rang out, shattering the lantern hanging on the command tent. Then came the war cries, shrill, terrifying ululations that echoed off the canyon walls, making it sound like 100 warriors were descending. In the confusion, Jonah burst from the tent. He sprinted toward Lila. She saw him coming, her eyes widening in disbelief. He slashed the ropes binding her to the stake. "Run!" Jonah shouted, pulling her up. "To the river!" "Well, look at this," a voice grated from the shadows. Jonah shoved Lila behind him. The leader of the Iron Hooves, the man with the branded arm, stepped out from behind a wagon. He held a heavy cavalry saber in one hand and a pistol in the other. He did not look at the hills. He looked only at Jonah. "I know you." The man grinned, his teeth yellow in the firelight. "You are the scout, the one who was late." "Not this time," Jonah said. The man raised his pistol. Jonah threw his knife. It was a desperate throw, aimed not to kill but to distract. The blade sank into the man's shoulder. The pistol fired wide, the bullet kicking up dirt at Jonah's feet. The man roared, dropping the gun and charging with the saber. Jonah had no weapon left but his hands and the tomahawk at his belt. He sidestepped the slashing blade, the steel whistling past his ear. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, driving him back toward the fire. It was a brutal, ugly fight. They grappled in the mud, The mercenary was strong, fueled by pain and rage. He brought the pommel of the saber down on Jonah's head, opening a gash above his eye. Blood blinded Jonah for a second. He felt the man's hands around his throat, squeezing. "I should have killed you 6 years ago," the man hissed, his face inches from Jonah's. Jonah reached down, his fingers finding the handle of the tomahawk. He did not think about honor. He thought about the burning village. He thought about Lila behind him. "You killed enough," Jonah choked out. He swung the tomahawk upward in a short, vicious arc. The blunt side struck the man under the chin with a sickening crunch of bone. The mercenary reeled back, falling onto the edge of the fire. He screamed as the coals bit into his back, scrambling away. The fight gone out of him. Jonah stood swaying, his chest heaving, blood streaming down his face. He grabbed the fallen saber. "Jonah!" Lila screamed. He turned. Varner was there, aiming a small Derringer pistol at Lila's chest. His face was pale, sweating. "Drop it!" Varner shrieked. "Or I kill her!" The gunfire from the hills had stopped. The silence was sudden and heavy. "You have lost Caleb," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "Look." Varner flicked his eyes to the perimeter. Emerging from the darkness were not just Lakota warriors. Sheriff Briggs sat on his horse at the edge of the camp. Behind him were 10 deputies and Dr. Miller, who doubled as the coroner. Briggs looked at the scene. He saw the mercenaries' men known to be criminals. He saw the branded man groaning in the mud. He saw Varner holding a gun on an unarmed woman. And he saw Chayton standing on the ridge, his rifle lowered, flanked by 4 silent warriors who had not fired a shot to kill, only to contain. "Sheriff!" Varner shouted, his voice cracking. "Thank God these savages attacked us. The mountain man is with them. Shoot him!" Briggs rode forward slowly. He looked at the branded man. He looked at Lila's torn dress and bruised wrists. "It does not look like an Indian raid to me. Mr. Varner," Briggs said. His voice was steady for the first time in years. "It looks like a kidnapping, an attempted murder. I own this town," Varner spat, the gun shaking in his hand. "I own you, Briggs." "You leased me," Briggs said, dismounting. "The lease just expired." He drew his revolver. "Drop the gun, Caleb, or so help me God. I will drop you." Varner looked at Briggs. He looked at Jonah, who was taking a step forward, the saber heavy in his hand. He looked at Chayton on the hill. He realized, with a dawning horror, that his money was no good here, not in the face of this much truth. Varner's hand wavered. He looked at Lila one last time with pure venom, then threw the Derringer into the dirt. "This is a mistake," Varner muttered as the deputies moved in to grab him. "I will have your badges. I will have all your heads." Jonah did not listen. He dropped the saber and turned to Lila. She did not wait. She ran to him, colliding with his chest. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his wet, blood-stained buckskins. "Tommy," she sobbed. "River," Jonah rasped, wrapping his arms around her, holding her up as his own legs began to shake. "He is safe. Downstream." Lila pulled back, her hands framing his face, thumbs wiping away the blood from his cut. "You came," she whispered. "You came into the fire." "I told you," Jonah said, leaning his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I pay my debts." "No," she said, her voice breaking. This was not a debt. On the ridge, Chayton lowered his rifle. He watched his brother holding the white woman in the ruin of the enemy camp. He saw the sheriff putting irons on the cattle king. The war for the water was over, but the battle for the peace had just begun. Jonah opened his eyes and looked at Briggs. "Get a wagon," he said. "We have a boy to find." Then the darkness at the edge of his vision rushed in, and for the first time in 6 years, Jonah Cade let himself fall, knowing someone was there to catch him. The smoke from the extinguished campfires hung low over the riverbank, mixing with the smell of wet earth and spent gunpowder. Sheriff Briggs stood in the center of the mercenary camp, his boots sinking slightly into the churned mud. In his hand, He held a leather-bound ledger that one of his deputies had retrieved from Caleb Varner's command tent, the tent Varner had not had time to burn in his panic. Briggs flipped the book open. Even in the dim light of the lanterns, the handwriting was damning. It was a list of payments. Payments to the men with the branded arms. Payments for removal of obstacles. Payments for kerosene. And a drafted letter to the territorial governor, claiming that a savage uprising necessitated the immediate seizure of the marsh water rights for the safety of the Commonwealth. Briggs looked up from the book. He looked at Caleb Varner, who was standing near the wagon, his fine suit splattered with river muck, his hands shaking as a deputy held his arms. "It is all here, Caleb," Briggs said, his voice heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than his bones. "Every dollar you paid to burn this valley down, every lie you paid me to ignore, that book is circumstantial." Varner spat, though his eyes darted wildly around the circle of grim-faced lawmen. "I am a businessman. I keep records of security expenses. You cannot prove intent." "I can prove you had a woman tied to a stake," Briggs said, closing the ledger with a snap. "And I can prove you held a gun to her chest while your hired dogs waited to assault her. That is not security. That is depravity." For years, Briggs had looked the other way. He had told himself that Varner was progress, that the railroad and the cattle drives were the future, and that men like Jonah Cade were just obstacles to that future. But tonight, seeing the brutality laid bare, the scales had fallen from his eyes. He realized he had not been protecting the law. He had been protecting a monster. "Caleb Varner," Briggs said, holstering his own revolver and pulling a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and arson." Varner's face twisted. The mask of the civilized gentleman dissolved, revealing the cornered rat beneath. "You will regret this." "Briggs." Varner screamed. "I made you, I own this county. You think a few pages of scribbles can stop me?" He wrenched his arm free from the deputy's grip with a surge of desperate strength. His hand dove inside his coat. He was not reaching for a wallet. He was reaching for the backup pistol he kept in a shoulder holster. "Drop it," Briggs shouted, reaching for his own gun. But he was slow, too slow. Varner's hand came out, the metal of a snub-nosed revolver glinting in the firelight. He leveled it not at Briggs, but at Lila, who was standing 10 feet away, supporting Jonah. If he was going down, he was going to take the object of his obsession with him. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. It did not come from the sheriff. It came from the darkness of the ridge above. Chayton had not left his post. The bullet struck Caleb Varner in the right hand, shattering the wrist. Varner shrieked, a high, thin sound, and the pistol flew from his grasp. The force of the impact spun him around, and he stumbled backward. His boot slipped on the slick bank, with a splash that sounded almost comical. The cattle king of Red Hollow fell backward into the mud of the Sweetwater Fork. He landed hard in the muck, the very earth he had tried to steal now rising up to swallow him. He thrashed there, clutching his ruined hand, his expensive gray suit soaking up the slime and the filth of the river. "Get him out," Briggs ordered his deputies, his voice devoid of sympathy. "And throw him in the wagon. If he bleeds on the upholstery, he pays for the cleaning." Jonah Cade watched Varner being dragged from the mud. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching the scene from a great distance. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the fight, through the swim, through the terror of seeing Lila bound, was draining away, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. He swayed on his feet. The cut on his head was throbbing in time with his heart. His vision blurred at the edges, tunneling down until all he could see was Lila's face. She turned to him, her eyes wide. "Jonah, he is in the mud," Jonah mumbled, a faint, crooked smile touching his lips. Appropriate. Then his knees simply ceased to exist. The ground rushed up to meet him. He did not hit the dirt. Lila caught him. She was smaller than him, but adrenaline gave her strength. She buckled under his weight, guiding him down gently until he was sitting, then lying on the wet grass. "Jonah, Jonah, look at me!" Lila's voice was shrill with panic. She pressed her hands against the side of his head, trying to staunch the flow of blood from the saber cut. Her dress was soaked from the river, her hair plastered to her cheeks. But Jonah thought she had never looked more beautiful. "I am fine," he whispered, though his voice sounded like gravel rattling in a tin can. "You are not fine," she cried, tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "You stupid, stubborn mountain man, you walked into a camp of 12 men. You could have been killed. Do you hear me? You could have died." She was angry. She was furious. She was scolding him the way a wife scolds a husband who has done something recklessly brave. Jonah reached up. His hand felt heavy, like lead, but he managed to touch her wrist. "Lila," he said softly. She choked on a sob, stopping her tirade. "What?" "I was not late," he breathed, his eyes fluttering shut. "This time, I was not late. The women, the children, safe." Lila froze. She understood. He was not just talking about her and Tommy. He was talking about the ghosts he had carried for 6 years, the guilt of the massacre that had driven him into the mountains. Tonight, he had balanced the ledger. "No," she whispered, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "You are right on time." Dr. Miller pushed through the circle of deputies. "Let me through, give him air." As the darkness took him, the last thing Jonah felt was Lila's hand holding his, refusing to let go. The morning sun that rose over Red Hollow 2 days later was bright and unforgiving, but it shone on a town that felt different. The air was clearer, stripped of the tension that had hung over the valley for months. Sheriff Briggs sat at his desk, dipping a pen into an inkwell. He was writing the most difficult report of his career. He addressed it to the district governor, regarding the incident at the Sweetwater Fork. Investigation confirms that the hostilities were instigated by a private mercenary group employed by Mr. Caleb Varner. The intervention of local citizen Jonah Cade and members of the Lakota tribe prevented a massacre of innocents. Contrary to previous alerts, the Lakota acted in defense of the peace. Briggs sanded the paper and set it aside. By writing those words, he was likely ending his career as a lawman who played it safe. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he could look at himself in the shaving mirror without flinching. Outside, the town was quiet. The news had spread like wildfire. Varner was in a cell in the county seat, awaiting trial. The details of his plan to burn the Marsh Ranch and frame the Indians had horrified the decent folk of Red Hollow. In the Mercantile, Mrs. Higgins and the church lady stood in a cluster, but they were not gossiping. They were silent. When they saw Tommy walking down the street with Chayton, who had brought the boy back to town after the fight, they did not turn away. Chayton walked tall, his rifle in a scabbard, leading a pony. Tommy looked tired but unharmed. "Mrs." Higgins stepped forward. She looked at the Lakota warrior, a man she had spent years calling a savage. Then she looked at the boy. Is Mrs. Marsh well?" she asked, her voice small. Chayton stopped. He looked at the woman with dark, unreadable eyes. "She is with the healer. She is strong, stronger than those who speak ill of her. Mrs." Higgins flushed a deep crimson. She looked down at her hands. If she needs linens or food, the church charity, we have plenty." It was not a full apology. But in Red Hollow, it was a seismic shift. The town was waking up from a long, ugly dream, realizing that the monsters were not the people living in the mountains or the women living alone, but the men in silk suits who bought their souls. At the county courthouse 3 days later, the gavel banged down with a sound like a gunshot, but this time, it signaled freedom. The district judge, a man who had traveled from Santa Fe upon reading Briggs' urgent telegrams, looked over the bench at Lila Marsh. She stood alone, dressed in a clean dress borrowed from the doctor's wife, her head held high. "Mrs. Marsh," the judge said, "based on the testimony of Dr. Miller regarding the autopsy of your late husband and the complete lack of evidence regarding any foul play, this court finds the rumors of poisoning to be baseless. The death is ruled accidental due to alcohol poisoning." A murmur went through the room. Lila let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a year. "Furthermore," the judge continued, picking up the foreclosure document. Given the criminal nature of the creditor, Caleb Varner, and the evidence of extortion and fraud presented by Sheriff Briggs, this debt is declared null and void. The lien is lifted. The water rights to the Sweetwater Fork remain solely and perpetually attached to the Marsh Ranch. Lila closed her eyes. She gripped the railing in front of her. She had her home. She had her name. And she had her son. Later that afternoon, a different kind of meeting took place in the sheriff's office. It was quieter, but perhaps more important. Briggs sat on one side of the table. Chayton sat on the other. A representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a nervous man named Mr. Sterling, sat between them. "The water runs through the ranch," Chayton said, his English slow and deliberate. "But the deer drink upstream. My people hunt the deer. If fences are built across the high currents, the game dies. The law says misses. Marsh owns the water," Sterling stammered. "The law of paper," Chayton said. "The law of earth says water belongs to no one." Briggs cleared his throat. Jonah Cade suggested a compromise. "Mrs. Marsh has agreed to leave the north sector unfenced. The Lakota may water their horses and hunt in the upper ravine. In exchange, the tribe agrees to alert the sheriff of any outside elements moving through the pass." Chayton looked at Briggs. He saw a man who was trying, however clumsily, to mend a broken bridge. "We do not need paper for this," Chayton said. "But if it makes you sleep better, we will agree. The water is life. We will share it." It was a fragile thing. This agreement, it was made of words and hope, liable to break under the pressure of history. But for today, the guns were holstered. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor of the small recovery room behind Dr. Miller's office. It smelled of rubbing alcohol, dried sage, and lemon polish. Jonah Cade sat on the edge of the cot. He was shirtless, his torso wrapped in fresh white bandages. The cut above his eye was stitched and sealed. He felt stiff, bruised, and incredibly old. The door opened softly. Lila stepped in. She carried a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. "Dr. Miller says you are too stubborn to stay in bed," she said, setting the basin on the small table. "I have slept enough," Jonah grunted. "A man rots if he lies down too long. A man dies if he bleeds out," she retorted gently. She dipped the cloth in the water and wrung it out. "Sit still. I need to clean the grit from your back." Jonah tensed as she moved behind him. He was not used to being cared for years. If he was hurt, he packed the wound with mud or cauterized it with a knife blade and kept moving. This tenderness felt dangerous. It disarmed him. Lila wiped the warm cloth across his shoulders, washing away the last traces of the river mud and the sweat of the fever that had gripped him for a day. Her touch was firm but careful, avoiding the angry red lines of the fresh wounds and the silver lines of the old ones. "You have so many scars. Jonah," she whispered, her hand lingering on the old bullet wound on his shoulder, the one from the massacre. "Maps," he said, his voice rough, "of places I should not have gone. And this one?" She touched the fresh bandage on his head. "That one is different," he said. "How?" He turned on the cot, wincing slightly, until he was facing her. The room was small. Her knees brushed against his. The air between them was thick, charged with the memory of the cold night in the mountain cabin. But now there was no storm outside to blame for their closeness. "That one led me here," Jonah said. He looked up at her, his gray eyes clear and vulnerable. "I did not do it just for the debt. Lila." "You know that." Lila dropped the cloth into the basin. Her hands were trembling. "I know. The debt is gone. The judge cleared it." "So you do not owe me anything," Jonah said. "I am free to go. You are free to stay." It was the moment of truth. He was giving her an out. He was the mountain man, the drifter. She was the landowner, the respectable widow. Lila reached out. She placed her palms flat against his bare chest, over his heart. She could feel the steady, strong rhythm of it. "I do not want to owe you, Jonah," she said, her voice low and husky. "Debts are heavy. I'm tired of carrying heavy things. She leaned in closer. He could smell the lavender water on her skin. Then what do you want? He asked, his breath catching. I want to choose, she said. I spent my whole life being told where to go, who to marry, what to sign. Today, I am choosing. She moved her hands up to his neck, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw. And what are you choosing? Jonah rasped. You, she whispered, if you will stay. Jonah made a sound deep in his throat, a sound of surrender. He reached up and covered her hands with his. I do not know how to be a rancher, Lila. I do not know how to live in a house that does not move. We will learn, she said. We will fix the fences. We will plant the corn. Tommy needs a father who knows how to stand when the wind blows. And she faltered, her blue eyes shining with unshed tears. I need a man who sees me, not as a witch, not as a widow, just me. Jonah leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. He pressed his forehead against hers. I see you, Lila. I saw you the first day in the square. You were the tallest thing in that valley. He kissed her. It was not a desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss like the one he had imagined 100 times. It was slow. It was gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. Her lips were soft, tasting of relief and promise. For a long time, there was only the sound of their breathing and the settling of the old building. The pain in his ribs faded, replaced by a warmth that spread through his chest like whiskey. Later that night, the moon rose high and white over Red Hollow. Jonah stood by the window of the room, looking out at the street below. He was dressed in a clean shirt Lila had bought for him, though it pulled tight across his shoulders. He saw a shadow move on the boardwalk opposite the clinic. Chayton stepped out into the moonlight. He did not look like he belonged in the town, yet he stood there with a quiet ownership. Jonah raised a hand in greeting. Chayton nodded. He lifted his arm, pointing not at Jonah, but up toward the vast, star-dusted ribbon of the Milky Way that stretched above the valley, mirroring the flow of the Sweetwater Fork below, the River of Souls. The Lakota called it. Jonah looked up. The stars were bright, burning with a cold, clean fire. For 6 years, he had looked at those stars and felt judged by the dead. He had seen the faces of the ones he failed to save. But tonight, the stars were just stars. Beautiful, distant, peaceful. He looked back down at the river that wound through the town. The mud that had swallowed Varner was already settling. The current was washing it clean, carrying the filth away, down to the ocean, leaving the water pure again. The blood was washing away. The debt was paid. Jonah turned back to the room. Lila was asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms on the side of his cot. She looked peaceful. He walked over and picked up a blanket, draping it gently over her shoulders. She stirred but did not wake. Jonah Cade, the mountain man who had ridden into town for a sack of grain, sat down in the darkness and watched her sleep. He realized with a jolt of wonder that he was not looking for the exit. He was not planning his route back to the snow line. He was home. The aspens along the ridges of the Bighorn Mountains had turned to spun gold, shivering in the cooling winds of late October. 3 months had passed since the mud of the Sweetwater Fork had swallowed Caleb Varner, and the valley of Red Hollow was breathing a new kind of air. It was crisp, clean, and for the first time in a decade, free of the stench of fear. Jonah Cade stood knee-deep in the icy water of the irrigation ditch, a shovel in his hand. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his forearm, leaving a streak of honest dirt. He looked down the line of the trench he had dug over the last 2 weeks. It was straight and true, lined with river stones to prevent erosion. The water flowed from the main creek, diverted by a cleverly constructed weir made of woven willow branches and packed clay, a design Chayton had taught him. It ran through the lower pasture, which had once been dry scrub, now turning a lush, stubborn green even as winter approached. And then, the water continued. It flowed under a newly built culvert and spilled into the open lands to the north, where a cluster of 6 Lakota teepees stood against the tree line. Smoke rose lazily from the lodges. Children, Lakota children were running in the tall grass. It was a sight that would have been impossible a season ago. A white rancher's water feeding an Indian camp. But the impossible was becoming the everyday at the Marsh Ranch. Jonah plunged the shovel back into the earth. The physical work was good. It kept his muscles hard and his mind quiet. But the quiet was becoming harder to maintain. He was a mountain man. His life had been measured in silent miles, in traps set and furs taken, in the solitude that was both a shield and a cage. He had stayed to fix the fences. He had stayed to harvest the hay. He had stayed to build the irrigation system. Now, the work was mostly done. The winter snows were gathering on the high peaks, white clouds snagging on the granite teeth of the mountains. The pass would be closed soon. If he was going to go, if he was going to return to the life he knew he had to leave now. He looked up at the house. The porch railing, once charred by arson, was replaced with fresh pine. The roof was patched. Smoke curled from the chimney, smelling of baking bread. It was a home, a real one, and that terrified him more than any grizzly bear he had ever faced. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. Were these hands meant to hold a plow, or were they only good for holding a rifle? He felt the weight of his past, the 6 years of blood and wandering. He wondered if a man like him could ever truly wash the stain of the massacre from his soul, even with all the water in the Sweetwater Fork, inside the house. Lila Marsh was kneading dough. She attacked the flour mixture with a rhythmic intensity, her knuckles dusting the wooden board. She paused, looking out the kitchen window. She could see Jonah in the field, a solitary figure against the vastness of the landscape. She watched the way he moved, efficient, powerful, yet carrying a stillness that belonged to the wild places. Her heart did a treacherous flip in her chest. She was afraid, too. Her first marriage had been a transaction of survival that turned into a prison of duty. Her husband had been a hard man, not cruel but possessive. He had owned the land, the cattle, and in his mind, he had owned her. She had fought so hard after his death to be Lila Marsh, landowner. To be free. Now, she found herself looking for Jonah every morning. She found herself making extra coffee. She found herself softening. If she let him stay, really stay, would she lose herself again? Would she become just Jonah's wife? Or was it possible to be something else? Partners, equals, two broken trees leaning against each other to withstand the wind. She saw him look toward the mountains. She saw that longing in his eyes, the pull of the horizon. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. He had never promised to stay forever. He had paid the debt. He had fought the war. He owed her nothing. The back door slammed open, shattering her reverie. Tommy burst in, his face flushed with wind and excitement. He was wearing a miniature version of a buckskin vest that Chayton had stitched for him. "Mama, Mama," Tommy shouted, jumping up and down. "Chayton says I have a seat like a warrior. He says I do not bounce anymore." Lila wiped her hands on her apron, a smile breaking through her worry. "He did he? And did you thank him?" "Yes, and I learned a new word," Tommy announced proudly. "Sunkawakan. It means holy dog. It means horse." Lila crouched down, smoothing his messy hair. The fear in his eyes, the shadow that had lived there since Varner's men had threatened him, was gone. It had been replaced by a confidence that brought tears to her eyes. "That is wonderful. Tommy," she whispered. "Jonah is going to show me how to shoe the pony tomorrow," Tommy said, grabbing a warm biscuit from the tray. He promised," Lila repeated softly. She looked out the window again. Jonah was walking back toward the barn, his shovel over his shoulder. He walked like a man carrying a heavy load, but he was walking toward them, not away. That evening, the air turned cold enough to see one's breath. A large fire was built down by the riverbank, on a patch of neutral ground between the ranch house and the Lakota encampment. It was a gathering that defied every convention of the West. Chayton sat on a log, wrapped in a buffalo robe. 3 other Lakota warriors sat with him, passing a pipe. Jonah sat on a rock, sharpening a stick. Lila sat on a blanket, with Tommy leaning against her knee. They ate roasted venison, the meat procured by the Lakota hunters from the upper ridges, seasoned with sage from Lila's garden. It was a meal of shared resources. Chayton stood up as the fire crackled, sending sparks drifting toward the stars. He gestured to the dark, rushing water of the river beside them. "The white men draw lines on paper," Chayton began, his voice melodic and deep. "They say, 'This square is mine, that square is yours.' They try to cut the earth into pieces." He looked at Tommy, who was watching him with wide, worshipping eyes. "But my grandfather told a story," Chayton continued. "He said that long ago. A great snake slid down from the mountains. He was thirsty. He drank the snowmelt. As he slithered to the plains, his body carved the channel of this river. He left his spirit in the water." Chayton picked up a stone and tossed it into the current. "The river is a living thing. It has a heartbeat. If you try to choke it, if you try to hoard it, the snake wakes up and strikes. The water turns bitter. The land dies." He turned his gaze to Jonah. "But if you let the snake breathe, if you understand that the water belongs to the thirst, not to the man, then the river feeds everyone. It becomes blood. It binds us." Jonah looked at the water. He thought about the blood that had been spilled into it months ago. Varner's greed had poisoned the valley. But now, the water was running clear. "We are bound," Jonah said quietly, "by the water, and by the fight to keep it." Chayton nodded. "A family is not just blood of the vein, brother. A family is those who stand in the same circle when the wolves come." Lila looked around the fire. She saw the Lakota warriors, men she had once been told were demons. Nodding in agreement, she saw Jonah, the solitary mountain man, sitting shoulder to shoulder with them. She saw her son, safe and happy. This was a family. It was strange, it was unexpected, and it was beautiful. Later, after the fire had died down to glowing embers and Chayton had returned to his lodge, Jonah and Lila walked along the riverbank. The moon was a sliver of silver, hanging low. The sound of the water was loud in the silence. "Tommy is asleep," Lila said, pulling her shawl tighter against the chill. "He put his moccasins under his pillow." "He is a good boy," Jonah said. "He learns fast." They walked for another 50 yards in silence. The tension that had been building all day, all month, was vibrating between them. "The pass will be snowed in by next week," Jonah said. He did not look at her. He looked at the water. Lila stopped walking. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I know." "I need to decide," Jonah said. "If I am staying, or if I am riding out before the drift gets too deep." Lila turned to him. She did not plead. She did not cry. She stood tall, the way she had stood on the platform in town. "Why would you go?" she asked. Jonah sighed, a sound of deep frustration. "Lila, look at me. I am a rough man. I have killed men. I have spent 10 years sleeping on rocks. I do not know how to be a husband, a father. I am afraid I will break it. I am afraid the blood on my hands will stain this place." "The rain washed the blood away." "Jonah," Lila said fiercely. She stepped closer to him. "And you are not just a rough man. You are the man who rode into a fire for a child that was not his. You are the man who sold his gold to save a stranger." "I was trying to buy forgiveness," Jonah rasped. "You earned it," she said. "And you earned a place here." She reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, cold from the night air. Her hand was warm. "I was afraid too," Lila confessed, her voice softening. "I was afraid of losing my voice, afraid of becoming property again. But you never tried to own me. Jonah, you stood beside me. You handed me the gun when the riders came. You let me choose." Jonah looked down at her. The moonlight caught the curve of her cheek, the determination in her eyes. "I never wanted to own you," he whispered. "I just wanted to be near you." "Then be near me," she said. Jonah felt the walls he had built around his heart, the stone walls of the mountains, the ice walls of his guilt crumble into dust. He realized that the freedom he had been chasing in the high country was an illusion. True freedom was not being alone. True freedom was choosing where you belonged. "I thought I was just passing through," Jonah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was a ghost, but every time I look at you, every time I see the boy, I feel real again. You make me want to build something, not just survive." Lila did not wait. She stepped into his space. She lifted her face to his. "Then build it with me." She breathed. She kissed him. It was not like the first kiss in the recovery room. That had been a promise. This was a seal. It was a long, slow kiss, deep and warm, tasting of the night air and the wood smoke and the undeniable future. Jonah's arms went around her, pulling her against him, burying his face in her hair. There was no desperation in it, only a profound sense of arrival. He was holding his world in his arms, and for the first time in his life, he was not looking for the exit. The next morning, the sun broke over the horizon with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. Lila woke early. She reached across the bed, but the other side was empty. Panic flared in her chest for a second, a cold, sharp spike. Had he gone, had the mountain called him one last time? She threw a wrapper over her nightdress and ran to the window. She looked out at the yard. The roan horse was there, grazing in the paddock. The mule was there, and Jonah was there. He was kneeling in the patch of earth near the south side of the house, the spot that got the best sun. He had a spade in his hand. Beside him lay a bundle of saplings, their roots wrapped in burlap. Lila ran out onto the porch, her bare feet hitting the cold wood. "Jonah!" He looked up. He was sweating, despite the morning chill. He smiled at her, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. "Apple trees," he said, patting the dirt around the thin trunk he had just planted. "And 2 peach. Storekeep says they might be hardy enough for this valley if we mulch them right." Lila walked down the steps, ignoring the cold. She stared at the saplings. "Fruit trees take 3 years to bear," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe 4. "I know," Jonah said. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. "I figure I will be here to pick them." It was a declaration louder than any shout. You do not plant fruit trees if you are leaving. You plant them if you believe in the future. Lila launched herself at him. He caught her, spinning her around, his laughter ringing out in the clear morning air. It was a sound the valley had never heard before, the sound of a mountain man who had finally come down from the cold. 2 weeks later, a buggy rattled down the lane. Sheriff Briggs pulled up, looking uncomfortable in a stiff collar. Jonah was on the porch, oiling a harness. Lila was sitting on the railing, sewing a button on Tommy's shirt. "Morning," Briggs said, tipping his hat. He looked at the repaired fences, the green pastures, the smoke rising from the chimney. He looked at Jonah, who no longer looked like a transient threat, but like the anchor of the ranch. "Sheriff," Jonah nodded. "I was, going through some paperwork," Briggs stammered. "County records, updating the census." He cleared his throat. "I noticed there is no official documentation regarding the current living arrangement. The church ladies are talking." "Let them talk," Lila said calmly. "They have plenty to say." "Well," Briggs reached into his pocket. "I just thought, since the circuit judge is coming through next month, if you wanted a license, I could fill out the preliminary forms. Save you the trip to town." He held out a folded piece of paper. A marriage license application. Lila blushed a deep, lovely shade of rose. She looked at Jonah. Jonah laughed. He stood up and walked down the steps. He took the paper from Briggs. "You are a persistent man, Briggs," Jonah said. "I just like things tidy." The sheriff grumbled. Jonah looked at Lila. "What do you think, Mrs. Marsh? You want to make an honest man out of me, or do you prefer living in sin with a savage mountain man?" Lila smiled, a radiant expression that made Briggs blink. "I think the mountain man is tamed enough. We can fill out the paper." "Good," Briggs said, relieved. "I will file it." "But not yet," Jonah said, handing the paper back, but keeping his hand on it for a moment. "Give us the winter. We have a barn to finish." and a herd to breed, paper is the last thing we need. We are building the life first. The paper can catch up." Briggs chuckled. "Fair enough, Cade, fair enough." The view from the high hill overlooking the marsh ranch was spectacular. It was spring now. The snow had melted from the lower slopes, feeding the Sweetwater Fork until it sang. The ranch below was a hive of activity. The cattle herd had grown a mix of Lila's original stock and wild strays Jonah had rounded up from the canyons. The irrigation ditches were full, turning the valley floor into an emerald carpet near the river. Tommy was racing his pony against a young Lakota boy. Their laughter drifted up on the wind, pure and unburdened by the history of blood that stained the soil beneath their hooves. Jonah sat on his big roan horse at the crest of the hill. Lila sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her chin resting on his shoulder. It was the same position they had been in months ago when they fled Red Hollow, running for their lives. But today, they were not running. Jonah rested his hand over hers where it clasped his belt. He felt the calluses on her fingers, the badge of her strength. He looked out at the valley. He saw the smoke from his chimney. He saw the smoke from Chayton's lodge. He saw the apple trees, their branches showing the first fuzz of green buds. "It is good land," Jonah said softly. "It is our land." Lila corrected him. "Yeah," Jonah smiled, looking at the horizon. "Ours." He turned the horse, not away from the valley, but toward it. "Let us go home," he said. Lila tightened her hold on him. "We are already there." They rode down the hill together, the mountain man and the widow, descending into the life they had carved out of rock and river. They had changed the flow of the water. They had changed the mind of a town, and in the end, they had changed the most stubborn thing of all their own destiny: love, loyalty, and the courage to stand when others ran. These were the things that turned a drifter into a father, a victim into a matriarch, and a battlefield into a garden. The history of Red Hollow would not be written in the ledger of Caleb Varner, but in the laughter of the children playing by the river that belonged to everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I poured 100 years of campfire memories into this tale, and I hope you felt the dust of the trail and the warmth of the hearth. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you in a bustling city dreaming of open plains? Or are you somewhere quiet with the wind outside your window? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Jonah and Lila's journey. If you enjoyed this ride, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like to help keep the fire burning, and if you really want to support these stories, hit that hype button so we can share the legend of the Sweetwater Fork with more folks around the world. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart true.